It's a great mic, Scott.
Thank you. It's my podcast mic.
Yeah, I like it. All right, guys, just a quick sound check. So we're live now. If everyone can write in the chat to make sure we've all got our audio, that'd be great.
Hi, Claire. Do you hear us?
Let's see. There's usually just a little bit of a lag when we go live and everyone else is logging in. So
are we live right now?
We're live, but we're just doing this. We're just doing a sound check. We'll know in a second if the audio is all good.
Oh, good.
All righty. Looks like it's good. Super. Let's kick off then. So, huge welcome, everybody. We've got a nice attendance this evening. Huge welcome to a conversation on grit, creativity, and flow with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, Stephen Kotler, and a new guest for all of you, Dr. Angela Duckworth as well. We're really delighted to welcome you both. And I just want to begin by sharing a little bit more, Angela, about your background. So Angela is the founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. And she's also a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 2013 was named a MacArthur Fellow. Prior to her career in research, she was a math and science teacher at public schools in New York City, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. And you are likely, I think everyone on this call is likely familiar with her incredible New York Times bestselling book, Grit. And if you're not yet, definitely recommend picking up a copy of that. It's a phenomenal book, and she's a total rock star in the space. So we're incredibly excited to be joined by you today, Angela. Thank you so much. And a lot of you are more familiar with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, at least through these calls. But Dr. Scott is a humanistic psychologist. He writes the column Beautiful Minds for Scientific American and hosts the Psychology Podcast, which is one of our favorites. And Dr. Kaufman has written many distinguished books. Among these is his most recent release, Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization, which tons of you have been loving after we did the book launch. There you go. Stephen's showing it up. And Scott received a PhD in cognitive psychology from Yale in 2015 and was named one of 50 groundbreaking scientists in the way we see the world. So we're super glad to have you back on with us, Scott. It's always a pleasure. But I want to kick off, Angela, with just a simple high-level question so that we can all begin on the same page, which is, what is grit?
I will give you my definition of grit, which is grit is a combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals. So it is both loving something for a very long time and working towards it, even when it's hard, even when there are setbacks.
Nice.
Is that succinct enough for you? I decided to be brief.
No, I love it. Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, do you have a question there, or you wanna mention anything?
No, I don't have a question. Let's keep rolling.
What are some of the ways that people can develop grit over time, Angela? Let's just start there.
Well, when I started studying grit, okay, I'm going to give you more than a sentence.
Please.
I was just curious, where do really successful people come from? I mean, is it just that they're more gifted or talented than the rest of us? And that's the journey that led me to the discovery that it's not just that they have ability in a field, athletic ability, musical ability, writing ability, but this combination of passion and perseverance over the long term ended up being very important. Actually, in my data, not correlated with any measure of talent or ability. So that was really interesting to me, that the people who love something for a really long time and work toward it consistently in a really dedicated way, they're not always the ones for whom everything comes easily. But that, of course, leads to your question, which is, great, but is it something I can change? And I do think that, really almost everything, Scott, you and I study, maybe actually everything you and I study, is malleable, is something, that we could say, like, yeah, if I want more of it, I could. Purpose, something that Scott wrote about movingly, I think, in his last book, and in the case of grit, can I become more passionate about something? Is there a chance for me to find even a calling? And then will I have the skill sets and the mindsets work toward that, even when times are tough. Yeah, wherever you are today, I don't think that that necessarily dictates where you'll be tomorrow.
That makes sense.
Do you?
Yeah.
I want to ask a question of both of you, and a lot of your work started out in military academies, things like that. Do you think grit for creatives works differently than in other cities? I know that's a weird question, but I
answer the question.
I think there's a difference there. No, I can't put my finger on what it is. I just think there is.
Well, Scott, you start on this one because I think of you as a world expert in the science of creativity.
Oh, go on. Tell me more. Tell me more.
And it's a very nice shirt you're wearing.
Yeah, you look fantastic.
Thank you. It's like the only shirt I own, and I mean, I wear it every day. But I'm glad you think it's good. Wow, yeah, I've really tried to think through that question. I wrote an article for Scientific American, which I'm sure Claire will find in 5 seconds, called "Creativity is much, much more than just 10,000 hours of deliberate practice." And in that article, I tried to talk through how creativity involves so many factors that are synergistic with each other, that interact. External factors like inspiring people in our environment, for instance, and support structures and resources, but internal factors as well, that with the creative process, you often see a lot of zigzags. You don't see a linear trajectory where you can even predict as a creative person that if you make choice A, then it will be positively impacted when you make choice C. Sometimes, like people like Picasso often said, I often don't know where I'm going till I get there. But with all that said, I'm a firm believer in the value of grit for creativity, in the sense that creativity does, and this is how I frame it in my talks when I give talks about the intersection between grit and creativity. I say, I show so trial and error. To me, it's all about the trial and error. You have to have perseverance and tenacity with this thing you love, even though you often experiment and it fails. You might blow out your laboratory, trying to find an experiment, then you start over again from day one the next day. To me, grit doesn't mean, and I don't think it means to Angela either, and she can, grit doesn't mean that you see it all before you see the full path, in some sort of linear way, and exactly the rules to take, and you just need grit to get there. I don't think that's how Angela conceptualizes it either, but because creative people often don't know where they're going, until something emerges through the process. I'd love to hear Angela's thoughts on that.
I agree with what Scott said, and I'll just point out. I mean, I think your question, for example, does grit in the creative realm, like my mom's a painter, right? So I think of her, she's an artist. Does that look the same as somebody who's trying to become a great basketball player or a, chess player? Not to say that basketball and chess aren't creative, but they're not like an artistic form like painting or sculpture or dance, etc., music. I don't want to make grit into this amoeba that includes everything. So I think it's helpful to say that creativity and grit are different, right? Somebody who's really good at coming up with novel ideas that are useful is not this. That's not synonymous with having passion and perseverance. But I do think that to be productive in a creative art, whether you're producing films or music or watercolors, there's so much trial and error, as Scott was saying, because it's not predictable, because it's not linear, and therefore it's hard to imagine, somebody having, really productive, creative career without having perseverance and passion. So I think of creativity and grit as kind of necessary and sufficient to having a very successful, creative, and productive career.
I love her answer.
I think there's something. Oh, I do. I'm sorry, Scott. Please finish.
Can I bust a myth? Can I bust a myth? Can I do a myth busting?
Please.
Myth busting. I can't even say it. Okay. So someone just wrote in the chat.
Have we started drinking already? Scott's already slurring.
You guys are. This is a rowdy bunch.
I had so much water beforehand. That might not be a good idea. But anyway, I said I did start drinking water. But Someone wrote, Randy Harrison wrote, exploration is a key element of creativity, isn't it? And this is the myth I want to bust. So my colleague Reb Rebel and I wanted to specifically look at the correlation between grit, according to Angela's scale, the grit scale, and your diversity of experiences, or the amount you really just love to, you just have a wide range of interests, and you're always looking to see how different interests are connecting the dots, and we found that the perseverance aspect of Angela's grit scale is quite strongly positively correlated with this sort of explorative drive for lots of different things. We found lots of other interesting things, which I'm not going to go on right now, but just for making that point, I want to say that there's nothing incompatible about being the kind of creative, explorative spirit, and also being the kind of person who gets things done, that you're passionate about, that has a lot of passion for what you're doing, that is really constantly persevering to be better and better and better and have mastery. There's nothing compatible there. So that's what our study found, and we're actually writing that paper up right now. We have 3 studies showing that.
Quick question for you, Scott, on clarification. When you say diversity of experience, that's a different metric than openness to experience.
We created a new scale. Yeah, correct.
Okay.
We created the diversity of interest scale. It never existed before, and we found that it predicts lots of things above and beyond openness. In terms of creativity and well-being and happiness.
Let me clarify, by the way, my question, because I completely agree. I always say Dorothy Parker once said that writing is the art of applying the ass to the seat, which I always loved. So I actually the thing that's really interesting, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this particular intersection, and I think it's one of the things that sort of flow makes easier when it shows up in creativity, is that I think for creatives, the grit is actually it's harder, because you're facing a blank page, an empty canvas, a space where you're not exactly certain what a successful outcome is, right? So there's a level of uncertainty in creativity that seems to amplify anxiety for a lot of people. I think flow on a certain level assuages that. It makes facing the blank canvas, the blank page, the whatever it is, a little easier. I think that's one of the things that flow does. So there is really interesting work going all the way back to Mike's work, Csikszentmihalyi High's work on grit as flow is a very good predictor of grit.
I have only done one study where I tried to measure something akin to flow. It was a scale about attentional engagement, which I think is really the heart of flow. And it was a scale. Yeah, I mean, you guys would know better than me. I think Marty Seligman and Chris Peterson developed it. They certainly used it, and I found a very strong correlation between people who were, at least on my scale, gritty, and then people who scored high on flow and attentional engagement. And the question of why that is, I think, is complex. And my guess is that there are multiple reasons why, not least of which is if you are really gritty, that over time you get good at something. I mean, which is, by the way, I think the gratification that I think a lot of us would say, that's the kind of happiness they're looking for in life, to have some kind of quality and excellence in what they do, different from pleasure, different from, comfortable life. And flow, so far as I understand it, this voluntary attentional absorption is something is very often in the circumstances where you are doing something that requires a lot of skill and you have that skill. So there's this beautiful kind of matching of high skill, high challenge. And it's hard to imagine how you would get to the high skill part without actually being dedicated to something and doing it for a long time with a lot of effort.
Mm.
And just out of curiosity, passion's one of the potent intrinsic motivators. Have you looked at others, curiosity and grit, mastery, autonomy? Have you looked at how any of those roll in?
I looked at a questionnaire or measure that Ken Sheldon, the psychologist, has on autonomous motivation, or intrinsic motivation. There were goals that you could just spontaneously offer, this is in a sample of about 300 adults. So you had to like write down things that you were currently working on that were important to you for whatever reason. But then you had to rate those goals. And in particular, you had to rate them on, how interesting they were, how valuable and important, instrumental they were to like other goals that you had. And then they had extrinsic motivation questions like how much do you feel like kind of like you have to do this? You don't really want to, but you have to, so you're feeling coerced. Or like really extrinsic kind of like, is this to make money, or like this is really just, I could have been doing anything, but I'm doing this to further some end. And the data suggested that when people are gritty, they tend to have goals that are really motivated by personal interest and by, values and like personal importance, and not so much the extrinsic or coerced motives. So that to me suggests that, if you want to be gritty, it's not from having tiger parents. And if you want to build, for example, like a gritty team, they're the people who are working with you are not going to be gritty because, you're like, making them afraid of you, or like, giving them performance bonuses because, you've created all these extrinsic, punishments and rewards. So I think there's a lot to say about, intrinsic motivation as being the foundations of passion. And by the way, Scott knows better than I do, but there are people like Valorant and others, who just, compared to my molehill, know a mountain about this, but that's just the little bit I know from the data that I collected.
Can I ask Angela a question?
Please, Scott. Yeah.
No.
Have you looked at the correlation? I'll stop. I respect you. So I am curious if you looked at the correlation between grit and social media use. I really I've been really getting to Cal Newport's new book, which is really inspiring me. I forget the title of it, but Claire, get on that.
Claire will find it. It's Deep Work 2.
No, it's something else. But
I think it's digital minimalism.
Deeper Work.
It's all about. No, it's not the Deep Work one. His most recent one is all about. He is so laser focused on minimizing distractions, and he's so good at focusing. He's such a great example of a human that can focus so intently on what matters most to him and ignore distractions. I would say he has a lot of grit, but there's something he has. He's such a good concentrator. I'm just wondering if you looked at the correlation between grit as a personality trait and your online, the quality of the use of it.
I haven't. I guess your hypothesis, Scott, is that gritty people tend not to spend hours and hours and hours on social media. Is that right?
I guess you got it too.
Well, could you take it one step further and say gritty people have less of an affinity for dopamine?
I don't think that's right.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I don't know much about, dopamine, and I have a degree in neurobiology, but that's from 1992, so it has expired.
Oh, wow. Yours really has expired.
It's really, way past the expiration date. So nobody should take anything I say seriously about, dopamine or serotonin. But I don't think it's that people who are gritty don't want to have like positive stimulation. I think that the thing is about somebody who is really gritty, like, Will Shortz, right? Like, how do you not get bored of crossword puzzles when it's all you do and it's only thing you've really done puzzles since you were like 13 or something, right? Like, how is that possible? I think what is so admirable to me about really gritty people is that they are able to derive pleasure and even a sense of surprise and delight and novelty from getting into the nuances of a craft. Right? When you talk to like a 3-star Michelin chef, are they bored of food because they've been thinking about it for like their whole life? No, because everything is new. Like, they get in a new case of artichokes and it's like new, and they're seeing all these nuances, which frankly you and I, none of us are probably like, what? It's another case of artichokes, but they can see the differences. And I do think that gritty people, have a desire for dopamine, for stimulation, for positive experience, but maybe the way that they're getting it could be different.
That's interesting. Yeah, it almost sounds like resisting shiny object syndrome or impulsivity is potentially an element of the perseverance element of grit.
I mean, I want to especially given the format of this very special engagement that we're doing here, I want to say I read Range by David Epstein, and I know you
Great
guys,
book.
right? Great book, great guy too, right?
Yeah,
like,
great guy too.
What
Super
a
guy.
Great guy.
Yeah, we'll have him on soon too.
So when you talk to David,
back.
right? Like, about pursuing shiny objects, is it right? So one of the things, of course, that David argues centrally in Range is that that you can get into talk about myth busting, right? That excellence is not from specializing really, really early in life necessarily, and not looking left and not looking right, and I don't know, deciding to be like whatever you're going to be, like Will Shortz did actually, like so early in life, because he really is the exception. And I think the vast majority of high performing adults did a lot of exploration, a lot of trial and error, as Scott might say, like a lot of sampling before they, began to narrow in on something. And even then they probably cross-fertilize a lot. But I think there's something really powerful there, because I have had parents who are like, oh, my daughter is 7. Like, I have decided that they're going to be like a world-class biochemist. It's like, what? Like, that makes no sense, because life should be mostly sampling early, and then at some point, increasingly specialization with cross-fertilization, I think. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, well, there's a great phrase with respect to career development: build a pyramid, not a ladder, in terms of how you move up and progress, which I like related to that.
And I mean, one, I think it's you need I think Range, the why base is really incredible. One of the things that so pattern recognition, when you link ideas together, that produces a little bit of dopamine. Dopamine drives focus. Focus drives flow. So there's a creative trigger for flow, right? It's when you start linking ideas. It's why creative ideas spiral. One leads to the next, right? That sort of thing. One of the how did I get here, and what is the thought that I just lost? And I like it when I totally forget what I'm saying in front of 2,000 people live, because I'm not embarrassed at all. Yeah, I have no idea. I lost it. Rian, cover for me. I'm just going to cry to my hand here.
Pyramid.
It was such a great. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll play
Sailboat.
So this
Sailboat.
I'm sorry. No, I got it. One of the things that we find is very helpful, because most people tend to specialize as they get older, and when you specialize, that the distance essentially between thoughts is really narrow. So it doesn't tend to produce a big dopamine reaction. You tend to get you get that little crossword puzzle high. I filled in the right answer, and I feel a little bit better, but you don't get a big wow that can really start to drive flow. And one of the things that we really tell people is try to read 25 to 50 pages a day outside specialty. So you're actually giving the pattern recognition system raw material to work with, to find connections, to trigger creativity. And
I'm curious if you've had the same experience I've had, which is that, well, now finally I have a specialty, and I say finally because I didn't start graduate school until I was 32, so I'm a real late bloomer in many ways. But now that I do have a specialty, and I really identify as a psychologist, I feel like I experience everything as a psychologist. I'm always asking, like, why'd they do that? Like, what was the motivation? Like, how'd they do that? I feel like when I do cross-fertilize, like I'll just watch Top Chef, or I'll I have this like book of children's poems that's like in my bathroom, and like I just pick it up and I like randomly read one. I don't know what your experience is, but mine is that because I have some depth, because I do have a specialty, it enables me to read those extra 25 to 50 pages of things that are really outside, and I'm always sort of drawing connections back to my work, right? And that's, to me, like the thrill, right? So I think that if you really do have something which is deep and a craft, and you can see all the nuances that are, one bonus is that it's hard to be bored, because you it's a lens through which, like, the rest of your experience, whatever it is refracted.
I totally think that's true. I think that the more I've learned about flow, the more fun neuroscience textbooks have become to me. Because I get to, right? It's not just reading a general textbook. I'm reading a general textbook to learn what it connects to about flow that I think about, that sort of stuff I love. I think that's one of the best highs available on this planet to humans, actually.
And when we're really bored, it's very
neuroscience.
often because you're like, what is this? You know, when students, of course, roll their eyes and sigh and slump their shoulders and say, like, what's the point of this? I think what they're saying is, I don't see how this is connected to anything I care about. And that produces the emotion of boredom, which, you know, I think, well, I don't know what you guys think. In some ways, I think of boredom as the opposite of flow. Maybe flow has multiple opposites. But anyway, when you're really, really bored and you're crawling out of your skin, I don't think you're in flow.
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
I actually think extreme pain, maybe the opposite of flow. And because I tend to think of it in terms of choice.
Yeah, it's like voluntary, like voluntary intentional engagement.
What can you say in extreme pain? You can only think about the pain. It's the only, right? It's all your focus and flow, right? It's anywhere you turn your attention because you're in peak performance, you can start your choices. You have options. That's how I engrave the spectrum. But boredom would definitely be on there. And you know, you're looking at it from an engagement lens, which is totally right. And I've got a weird ass idea.
We're getting tons of sorry, Angela, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, I don't know that flow only has one quote unquote opposite, right? Because you know, if it's voluntary, extreme pain's a good example of it not being voluntary. And then if it's about engagement, boredom is a good example of not being engaged.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, we're getting tons of amazing questions here in the comments, which is great, folks. So keep them coming. So I just want to address a few of these. Scott, there's one here from Gemma. Is grit correlated with the autism spectrum?
I really like that question.
Yeah, you go first, Scott. I don't have an answer to it, but yeah.
Cool. Sure, I'd be happy to offer some thoughts on that. And there's an article that I hope Claire can find called "The Mind of the Prodigy" for Scientific American. What I find interesting is, you know, I wouldn't make the case that all routes or all best routes are through this sort of range pathway, and I don't think Epstein would argue that either. That might not work for some people. And what has really fascinated me is looking at prodigies, and prodigy can be defined as anyone who reaches world-class expertise before the age of 12. I mean, there's not that many, but they exist. And there was a certain period of my life where I became really obsessively fascinated with that group of people because they really blew out of this water the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. They did not have 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. They were such an extreme example of talent in a lot of ways, and ability to soak things up. Even at a very, very, very early age, even age 3, 4, they would sit down at the piano, and their learning trajectory, you know, in Angela's model, she has distance equals rate times time, and the rate part is how fast you learn something, and that's the talent part. And these prodigies showed a lot of talent. But here's the interesting thing that my research led me to about prodigies is that there was a much higher than average chance that they were on the autism spectrum in some way. And some people have started making that link between some autism genes and a real deep interest in focusing obsessively and narrowly as possible on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. And it's amazing what you can learn when you are 100% in on something. So some people at first glance may just look at the prodigy phenomenon and say, oh, they just show what talent you're born with it. But when I looked really closely and I tried to get into the nuance of it in my Mind of the Prodigy article, is I actually made the case that when the implicit learning system, that's what I studied in my dissertation in grad school, the implicit learning system, that pattern, that unconscious rule pattern detection system, when you focus all of your attention and energy on that, it's amazing what it can look like how talented you can look in something when you spend that much time letting your unconscious system learn the complex rule structure of a domain. And the only domains that prodigies show this in, by the way, are well positioned, with real clear rules to the domain, real rules. So, for instance, you rarely see prodigies in like creative writing. It's now you see great literature at age 8. but you can see great music performance. You go down the line, chess, you go down the line, they're all great rule structure domains. And I think they do show in the way the value of the path of intense concentration and narrowness, and at one thing at the exclusion of lots of other things.
Scott, is it true that most prodigies don't grow up to be adult geniuses? And if that's true, like where did their, I think Ellen Winter would use the term like the rage to master, right? Where did their obsessive interest, where did their passion, like what happens?
Yeah, so you're right. Indeed, Simonton has shown that most don't grow up to some just plateau. So they reach world-class expertise, but then they realize when they get an adult that a lot of people have world-class expertise in that domain when you're at the age of 30, a lot of people within that domain. And so they lose that motivation because it's not, they're not getting that rewards, of all the accolades. It's very exciting to an 8-year-old to be toured around the world and be on national media. It's a motivating force for a lot of them, and they seem to love it, but they tend to lose it. But the question of where did the passion come from in the first place, this is such a fascinating topic, and I think that we would be remiss if we ignored the role of genes, and that's why I really liked your model, which I just glossed over, so I didn't know if you wanted to take up the volley and elaborate on how you took the physics model of distance equals rate times time, and you applied it to the mechanics of achievement, because I think it's like one of the most brilliant things ever in our field. So I think it's valuable to this conversation. I didn't know if you wanted to pick up the volley there at all on that.
I'm happy to do that. I'm going to tell you about it, and I also don't want to say that that I'll say something about genes right afterwards.
Great.
So
Great.
Newton had the idea that we all learned at some point, maybe middle school or high school, that say you take a ball like this and you want to see like what's the distance, and you want to predict it. Well, if you know two things, if you know the rate at which the ball is going, like how fast it's going, and then how long it's going, right? So you could have the same distance if it's like a really fast moving ball, but only for a little bit. Or you could have a kind of tortoise ball, which is like going kind of slowly, but it does go for a long time. And so therefore it travels the same distance. So distance equals rate times time. Most of us are like, oh yeah, I remember that at some point. And I think that's very similar to the idea that achievement equals skill times effort. Right? So if you want to accomplish something, I hope you have high skill, and I hope you put in a lot of effort if that thing that you're trying to accomplish is really hard. And I think, it's kind of almost obvious, right, that to do something really great, like hopefully you're very skilled and you work really hard, because if either of those things are lacking, you're just never going to go the whole distance. But then you ask the question, like, where does skill come from? And without getting into calculus, I was actually a math teacher, so I found this like an adorable metaphor. I don't know how many people are like, calculus, it's a great metaphor. But just to, in simple terms, I think skill itself has an equation, right? Like, where does skill come from? Like, say you're a really, really good public speaker, or you're a fantastic novel writer. Like, how did you get so good? Well, we were already talking about practice. I do think there's an equation there, and that would, in my view, be talent times effort. Right? So talent times effort would give you skill. Anyway, then you do a little, substitution in math, and I think you would then say achievement is equal to your talent times your effort squared, because you sort of like substitute. Anyway, they're very, very hard to do with like hand waving, no blackboard. But I think the intuition is quite simple, which is that you can make a distinction between skill and talent, which are a little bit like how fast the ball's going, and how long the ball's going to go, and I think that's the intuition behind grit, right? That like you might not be the fastest learner, or maybe you are like Kobe Bryant, right? Like you're extremely talented. You're like you pick it up like that, but the magic of grit is actually doing things for a very long time. And honestly, if you ask me, like, who are the truly greatest achievers, they are typically like Kobe Bryant, like actually both talented and extraordinarily gritty. So they had both, right? So they have these, everything in the equation is like at maximum. And I think here's my little footnote on genetics. I think intuitively, and actually there's data on this, intuitively when we think of talent, we think it's genetic. But then when you ask people about effort, they think that's not genetic, that it's environmental or learned. And I don't think it's quite that simple, although we have a strong intuition, and I even have that intuition. It's like, yeah, it just feels like that should be. There's absolutely a genetic and an experiential or environmental component to both. So it's not the case that talent is entirely genetic and effort is entirely learned. It's messier than that, and in both cases, there's kind of nature and nurture.
Yeah, I love that you said that. You know, the twin studies suggest that, like IQ, for instance, and grit both have the same magnitude of heritability coefficients in lots of different environments. Yeah, people make all these assumptions.
I saw, like, wow, you really do get a lot of comments, and I can't read that fast. But Shafali said, doesn't feel right. Luck has to have a huge factor. Well, I just want to acknowledge that none of us have talked about circumstances, opportunity, luck. And especially current events, at least, you know, where I'm living, you know, in the United States, and Philadelphia in particular, like absolutely opportunity and luck, which are not about, you know, your psychology, right? They're about like your circumstances. Those are enormously important and should be acknowledged. And I think in the paper that I wrote, this like equation of, you know, Newton and all that, I said that, like, I'm not putting it in the equation because this is a psychology equation, but absolutely these other things matter enormously. So she's
totally
right.
I just put a link into the chat box of an article I wrote called "The Role of Luck in Life Success is Far Greater Than We Realized." Really cool physics model. I don't know if you saw that physics simulation, Angela, where they look to see, you know, giving people
it was like a paper published in the last few years, in like Nature or Science or
that's right,
like that. Yeah, I did see that. Yeah,
so fascinating, showing that, you know, not everyone comes from the same environmental opportunities, and also, you know, luck just plays just an overpowering role in lots of ways we don't realize. So anyway, I linked to that article.
Angela, can I ask a question, which is, can you talk a little about the relationship between autonomy and grit? One of the things, you know, if you go back, Martin Seligman may have written about this. Csikszentmihalyi wrote about it extensively. Autonomy and attention seem to be coupled systems, right? So you almost can't give something your undivided attention over a long period of time. You can do it, of course, for a short period of time, even forced into it or whatever, coerced. What have you seen about autonomy and grit over in your research?
So autonomy can mean lots of things. Can you just say a little bit more about how you're using the term autonomy? Like what is not autonomy? That would also help me. Like, you know.
So I'm probably using autonomy in the same way, kind of it shows up maybe in self-determination theory as in right. So you're doing what you were doing by choice. You're not being coerced into it or seduced into it, to use their language. That's sort of how I'm poking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So probably the data that is most relevant to that excellent question is the data I already spoke about a little bit with, you know, this Ken Sheldon goal scale where autonomous, I think he calls them self-concordant goals. Right. So they're chosen, like, this is what I want to do. I don't feel forced to do it. I don't have to do it, but I want to do it. That ended up being, you know, characteristic of really gritty people. So I think that's probably the most relevant. I can add to that, though. I've interviewed a lot of what I would consider paragons of grit, right? People who really exemplify passion and perseverance and high achievement. And I have myself not yet interviewed somebody who really said, like, you know, I was just forced into this. I say that with a little hesitation because I think Andre Agassi has said that he was totally forced into tennis and hated it like every second and yet became world class. So I wonder if you guys have thought about that, because that does seem to be a counterexample to my intuitions anyway. But I didn't interview anyone like that. Have you guys thought of the Andre Agassi counterexample?
It's interesting. I think his example only works if you become a speed freak along the way. I think that's how it helps. I'm joking. I mean, it did happen. I'm joking.
No offense, Andre.
No offense,
No.
Andre. So sorry.
I don't know him, and I haven't studied him as a case study. And I think he may have said that, he did realize at some point that like tennis was a thing that he could become world class in, and he really wanted to be world class in something. But as I said, I don't know. I do think that has to be rare, at least, right? That I mean, personally, I can't force myself to do much of anything for very long at all. I mean, really, the things that I do that are hard, that take a lot of effort, are things that I want to do. I mean, if you said, Angela, you have to become a political science professor, right, or a hedge fund manager, I mean, I'm pretty sure I'd be terrible, because I'm not very good at forcing myself to do things for even like 10 minutes that I really don't want to do.
Yeah. You all are raising some really interesting issues about the whole range, the different pathways to grit in life, the different ways that one can live the good life. I think personally about my own life story and how I obsessively focused on one goal and one goal only for like 10 years. And in such a narrow, like, I'm going to redefine intelligence. I'm going to redefine intelligence. And I just tried to block everything else out of my life. And I think about the benefits and disadvantages of that for my well-being, my health. And I'm not like that anymore. I'm now more diffuse and like lots of different things and fascinated. But I think about that point in my life from high school to the end of college or grad school. And I just think about that time in my life and those choices I made where, if I may toot my own horn, I was considered I was in Angela's book as a paragon of grit. So I'm talking as a.
What happened then? Did you feel like and then, well,
not to toot my own horn.
Gritty. Well, what did you feel at some point that you had, climbed Mount Everest, that like you had planted the flag? Like, did you feel like you had successfully redefined it? And then what happened? Like, tell me what happened next.
This is I've been doing a lot of reflection about my life here as I sit here during COVID and I can't leave my home. So I think about my life and the choices I've made. And I think about how all I ever wanted to do and my dad's in this chat room somewhere, so he can attest to this. There was a period of time where I made an explicit goal. I'm going to redefine intelligence. That's all I want to do in my life. I don't imagine a life after doing that. And I would say that the point where I did that was 2013. The culmination of that was my book, Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined. It was my first major book for a general audience. And that allowed me to put a stamp on, look, it's in the subtitle, Intelligence Redefined. See, I did it. I redefined intelligence. But then I was like, wait, now what? And I did face a bit of a crisis around 2013 after that book was published, where I was like, I didn't imagine in my head that there would be a life after grit. For me personally, I didn't imagine that there would be a life after being so gritty for 10 years, like at the exclusion of everything else in my life. I would just go to the library. I would live and breathe intelligence research. I would go to the library and just spend 8-9 hours a day reading all the books. You get the idea. That it did create a little bit of a crisis for me personally for a little while before I found another interest. But. And
then did you find, it sounds like you found other interests, plural, right? Is that like you didn't latch on to like another 10-year interest and then singularly focus on that? Is that right?
Oh no, I would say just, I guess my kind of personality is that I'm promiscuously gritty. That's how I'll say it. Or serially. Serial monogamy. That's what I'm trying to say.
Scott, can I ask a question just to interrupt, just for a nuance? This is one thing. So I've noticed this with writers. When writers write a book that, every book always feels like it's the book you were born to write because it's the culmination of things. But sort of always produces that feeling, right? But for early writers, they're not used to it. They don't know it. They've not had it before. So they're like, oh my God, I was born to do this thing. And that, which sounds like what your intelligence thing was.
That's
and
what
I've noticed
like.
that it's a block. Like it ends up being a block to future work. Like you have to if you think you wrote the perfect book, you sort of have to get over yourself to get to the next one. The worst writer's block I ever had was after I wrote Was to Jesus, the only time I actually thought I wrote a truly great book. Like all the other ones, I could immediately poke holes at as soon as it was done. But that one I was sure was, the one. And I ended up with writer's block for the only time I've ever had in my life. After that, I noticed that with a lot of other people. Like when you're climbing that mountain, something about climbing that mountain when you actually it seems to block things and know something.
What was it like right afterwards? How did you feel right after you finished? Your masterpiece.
Really happy. We're gonna keep that off the air. Let's just say I stayed very, very messed up for about a month. For a month straight, I did lots of drugs afterwards, is what I did, in all honesty. That one took 6 years. It was really, really hard. And I just went out and, stayed messed up.
Mardi Gras.
And you're different now?
That's about what I did.
And then what? And then, what was the next year like after you had written it?
Oh, no, that's time period is still going on.
It's still going on. It's still Mardi Gras.
I had to... Life conveniently provided some very humbling experiences on the back end of that sort of got me back to a more inquisitive place. What I found is that it's sort of like being an expert puts you in a fixed mindset and tends to block. I couldn't get back to a growth mindset, right? So I couldn't open up and learn and re-tap into curiosity. That was my experience. I know Scott's experience was different. That was sort of what I went through on that one.
I feel like I'm not as naive anymore, and it's and I mourn that in a sense. I mourn my innocence. Sorry if this is getting too existential, but there was I think about that Scott in those 10 years. I was pretty innocent in the sense that I had this idea that there would be a day where I would reach the goal, and then something heavens from above something would happen that didn't happen, or that was unrealistic to happen. And now I feel like I live life with more of a realistic understanding of, this is all going to be a process until I die. Until the day I die, this is actually one long process. But I feel like I'm not as innocent anymore in that sense. I don't know if any of you resonate with that at all.
That's interesting,
I think
Scott.
people are happiest when they're on the ascent. I think getting there, I mean, that may or may not, concord with your experience, but I'm happiest when I am making progress, not when I have made progress and I'm done. I know when Gary Becker, I think it's in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech for his prize in economics, and if not, it's in some autobiographical essay. I think he had said that after he finished writing a book, there would be a little depression, almost a kind of feeling of being lost, right? And I think people are happiest when they are pursuing goals that are meaningful to them, and you feel like you're really getting somewhere, right? That is when I'm happiest, anyway.
Me too.
Sermon Hillary said there are two kinds of people in the world. There are the people who like climbing Mount Everest, and there are the people who like having climbed Mount Everest.
Interesting.
Which I thought was an interesting. I always thought that was an interesting. And I have in the climbing world, I have actually met both of those groups of people there. He's definitely right about that.
I want to be Angela. I want to be sensitive to your time. I know we don't have too long left with you, unfortunately. Do you mind if I throw some quick audience questions to you?
I'd love to. I'll take a swing
we
at
have
that.
to let you go. Alrighty,
That'd
and obviously Scott, feel free, and Stephen to chime in. So we got one from Tim, which is relevant to what you were mentioning earlier. How does one maintain grit when the events of the world block me mentally and emotionally?
Yeah, I have to say, and I know, 2 months ago, I said, right now, everybody is experiencing some degree of stress and adversity and awfulness, but it's different for everybody. So it's just very hard to be empathic, honestly, right? Because if you're out of work, that's a different kind of stress than, losing a relative. That's a different kind of stress than whether you're sick. That's a different kind of stress. The list goes on. In the United States, anyway, I will say that my mind is exploding, and I haven't really been able to concentrate myself very well this week. That's why I look like this. It's usually look better than this, actually. not sleeping very well, etc. So I think maybe the only thing that I could offer that I'm trying to remember myself is that, I think being gritty doesn't mean that like every single day, you're running a marathon. In other words, like there are going to be some ebbs and flows in your energy, in your focus. There are even times where I'm like, the heck with this. It's like too hard, right? Like I work a lot in education with kids and teachers, and some of these issues are like so complex, and it's so hard to say things that are helpful and not be taken the wrong way. And I'm like, ugh. So I don't think that grit means that your motivation is this, like all the time, 10 out of 10. I think there are dips. And I think what it means to be gritty is that, there is some like a deep wellspring, which like eventually gets you back. And so maybe it'll be a few days, and maybe it'll be a little longer. What we're experiencing today as a global culture is just unprecedented. So cutting yourself some slack is recommended, at least by this grit researcher.
Angela, how do you think about you don't think of grit and resilience as the same thing? Do you think of them as different things? And where do you draw those lines, et cetera, et cetera?
I think of resilience as a component of perseverance. So I don't think they're unrelated. Of course, they're related, but you can be really resilient and not have a passion, for example, right? Like, something that you love every day and like kind of is a voluntary obsession and like puts you into flow. And I don't think those are necessarily parts of resilience. So I think of grit as a kind of complex, I'll use the word phenotype. I'm sure that's very unhelpful, but anyway, and that it includes resilience, but also having intrinsic interest in what you do, and also, a habit of deliberate practice, and also a sense of purpose. So I think of resilience as being overlapping with grit, but not the same exact thing as grit.
Thank you.
Interesting. One of the questions, Angela, we like to ask experts like yourself is we call the research genie question. So if you could click your fingers and in an instant have any research be done or any question be answered, what would that be?
Oh, that is a really excellent question. Well, what I am working on and expect to be working on forever, though maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm in that period of innocence that God is mourning, is I really, really, really want to know how people can intentionally develop a passion and become more persevering. I am working on it, and there are some small victories. There are a lot of things that like don't work, but if I could snap my fingers and know the answer, like, oh yeah, how do I increase my grit by 50% tomorrow, should I want to, I would. I don't think I can. If you know of such a genie, you must tell me more at another time.
We don't have it yet. Working on it too. And then Angela, so we got a couple of minutes. Where can folks learn more, dive deeper into your work?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a website that's free. You don't have to buy my book. You can go to characterlab.org, and it is a website that is funded by foundations and individuals. And Scott has contributed to it, and Adam Grant has contributed to it. I've contributed. So it's actually called Character Lab because, and if I have final words, I'd love them to be this. I have never said, and I don't believe, that grit is the only thing that you want to develop in life. I think it's very important to develop creativity and honesty, and now more than ever, empathy and compassion, kindness, generosity, gratitude, which we, can never have enough of, humility, which our country doesn't have enough of, at least certain world leaders. So character is what Aristotle said was the good life, and I think it's all the things that we are that are good for other people as well as for ourselves. And if I have a last word, I was like, that's why I love Scott's books so much. Transcend is all about that. Like, that's the good life. And if we could get everyone to read it, then that would be a great thing.
Thank you.
Nice.
By the way, everybody who's listening, if you haven't read Scott's book, Transcend,
no, buy it.
Go out, you should buy it right now. Can we get the Amazon link? Hey, Claire, can we get the Amazon link? I think
Thank you,
there's
guys.
2,000 people is called If We All Buy an Extra Copy Right Now, We Can Put Scott back at the top of the bestseller list.
You're all such
I'm just
amazing
saying.
friends. You're such amazing friends. I actually am bursting here when Angela gets off. I know we're going to have some more time. I'll be here. I actually thought of a lot of other things that Angela didn't mention that are awesome about her stuff that I hope you give me a chance to mention, because
Scott and I have a Vulcan mind meld. So and I can tell all the 2,000 people were saying, so the reason I have to go is because my teenage daughter, like, is making me dinner. So, that would make me a very bad mom if I missed. So anyway, so I'm sorry I can't stay for the last half hour, but
hopefully we'll get you back on.
You.
I will continue your
come back.
legacy for the next 10
And
hours.
also, I just want to mention, everyone should also buy Angela's book, Grit. I presume a lot of people have already read it, but Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, phenomenal read. And thank you so much, Angela. It's been amazing having you on board here.
All right. Much love to all.
Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Angela.
Enjoy dinner.
Enjoy dinner.
It'll be delicious, whatever it is.
Yeah, I hope it's not burnt.
All the best.
I wanted to mention Angela's tip of the week that she does. She has this newsletter that I think you can sign up for, and her tips of the week are really incredible, and they've been really inspiring to me. And I've been reading them every week, and they're always just right. They're spot on. So I wanted to plug that too.
Oh, nice. That's great. Yeah, we'll throw the link for that. And did you want to dive straight in, Scott? Was there anything you wanted to mention beyond that in terms of Angela's work?
There's a lot I wanted to say because I'm a big Angela Duckworth fan, and I'm really glad that I was able to bring her in today and that she did this. I hope people realize just how amazing it is that she just did that for you all for free for an hour. It was such a privilege, for me to be able to do this. I hope people realize just the enormity of that, the fact that Angela Duckworth was just with us, on this webinar for an hour. She does.
Thank you, Scott, by the way, for setting it all up. I should have mentioned that earlier.
No, of course. I mean, I was so excited that it worked out. What I really like is her education work, and it's real foundational to changing the whole education system to look beyond standardized test scores as the most important metric or worth of a child, and actually saying character matters. And I so wonder if anyone has any questions about that character aspect or character education, but I see it as a real way forward in education, in recognizing that things like kindness, bravery, curiosity, these are seeming intangibles, but they're things that we should be measuring in school that we should be developing in school above and beyond standardized test scores. And that's something both she and I have been united in trying to change in the education system.
Yeah, it's huge, Scott. Super important work.
Scott, let me ask you just to take that one step further. Martin Seligman, obviously, and Chris Peterson, they wrote, that really famous book at this point, Character, Strengths, and Virtues. What do you think of their idea around virtues, especially as it relates to strength and motivation and things along those lines? What's your thinking on that?
Well, you talk about their distinction between character strengths and virtues.
I mean, I liked what you were talking about it as sort of character development in school. They took it one step further, these 6 classical virtues. I could never tell if that was because they got money from the Templeton Foundation, and the Templeton Foundation loves the idea of virtues, or if there was something actually solid and psychological there that went beyond the kind of the historical analysis that they did.
So I wouldn't get so hung up on the word virtues, because it really was more theoretically based. I wasn't there around the time when Templeton, and actually I can't speak to that political aspect of it, but I can say that when you do factor analyses today, or you do these robust statistical analysis, see how do all these character strengths group together, there's no statistically thing guiding us telling, oh, that's a virtue, that's not a virtue. So I want to be very clear about that these, I think sometimes that's a judgment call, and I would make the case that maybe scientists really aren't in the business of deriving values from facts, and so perhaps we, in the field of positive psychology, we need to actually dial down our judgments of certain character strengths as, oh, that's more virtuous than others. I think it's much better way of thinking about it is that we all have different character strengths, or what Martin Seligman calls signature strengths. Those are strengths that light us up, that make us feel most energized, we're engaged in them. And I'd get rid of the virtuous label, because I'm not in the business of saying, oh, your signature strength is more virtuous than that person's signature strength. I don't think I'm in the business of doing that. I'm in the business of as well as a lot of coaches. They're in the business of strength spotting. What are the highest signature strengths of each individual, and how can we develop them? So yeah, my answer to that question is I'd be inclined to not talk about such language, and it's not really discussed much anyway, that the word virtues, besides that book.
I always wondered about it because of that. This was from that book, but and I think it's an idea that it's a lot more testing. Though I think it's right. Martin has said that he finds that if you work using 1 to 5 of your big signature strengths, that's the best recipe for a high flow lifestyle. Is when the work you're doing really relies on your core strengths. This whole thing, sort of the grit discussion we had earlier with Angela, all these things are sort of woven together in really interesting ways. I look towards the neurobiology because it gets this mechanism and helps me tease it apart, because these things are so overlaid. But that's just my framework for trying to understand this stuff.
I love that.
Yeah, I got a question. Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
The flow, the connection flow and character strengths, I've seen some research on that, and they show that the key there is to make sure that you use your character strengths as much as possible
in a new way.
In new ways. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in a new way. That's totally it.
You knew where I was going with that.
I'm learning I'm trying to learn how to rail slide on skis, and which it's summer, so I'm doing it on dirt in a backyard setup. And I was thinking about that very thing yesterday as I hit the ground on my 11th time and ripped up my arm again. And I was like, Martin Seligman would tell me that this is supposed to be really fucking flowy. And I'm not feeling very flowy right now. I was thinking about that very thing yesterday.
That's funny.
It's hilarious. Yeah, we should link to a picture of you doing that soon. So one question from Stephen Parton, which is interesting. He put this in earlier, but it's worth addressing now, I think. So he says, it feels like we're talking about these terms as if they're simple traits you just decide to activate. But realistically, what we're talking about here is unlocking neurological states that we struggle to access because of genes, environment, and the interaction between those. Can we speak more specifically to the tangible inhibitors of grit, e.g. amygdala activation or fear, and things that promote grit, e.g. sense of security, sense of meaning, or intrinsic motivation?
Well, one, if you're going to go to the amygdala for fear, you can't go to soft psychological terms for the other side, right? We got to pick a level of, if we're going to talk about, one or the other.
Any thoughts on that, Scott? That question?
I think I really wanted to let Stephen address that one. That's up his bailiwick, as they say.
I'll throw another one into. Yeah, I'm going to throw another one into the mix. Stephen, you can you can work off this as well. So Samit says, can grit be developed as a strategy to override a lack of discipline?
That's interesting. So let me say, some of this stuff is coming out in work that in a book that I've got coming out next year. But when you talk to peak performers, Angela's work on grit is excellent, and a really to me it's a really interesting place to start. When you talk to peak performers, they will talk about 5 to 6 different kinds of grit skills that they feel the need to train, and they train them all independently, so they don't seem to overlap, which is really weird. And so just to run through some of them, I don't know if I'll get all of them, but obvious that the core, there's just perseverance, right? Kick me in the teeth, sing my praises, doesn't matter, I'm still coming. There's also the grit to control your thoughts, right? Which we use mindfulness for that, and it's a separate kind of grit. Like we know, for example, when it comes to perseverance, there's a lot of data that says it is useful to train physical perseverance first and then cognitive perseverance second. For whatever reason, it seems to build it up more Obviously, that doesn't hold at all with the grit to control your thought. There's also the grit to train weaknesses, which is a different skill. And one of my favorite, this was Josh Waitzkin and I were talking about this. We were talking about all the different things. He said the most important grit skill you can possibly train is the grit to be at your best when you're at your absolute worst. And, you know, when I give the example for that, what does that look like? I talk about when I write a new speech, I practice it a handful of times. I'll do it in front of a friend or whatever. And then I will take my dogs and I'll go hike up a mountain after I've been up late the night before and I've worked all day and I'm really exhausted, and I will hike up a mountain and I will try to do my speech then, because I am at my absolute worst. There was a question earlier, the one that we sort of skipped over, about getting past the amygdala. This is why, right? I am training under conditions that are absolutely the worst, so that when I encounter things that go wrong in real life, they're not as panicky, because I'm like, well, fuck, I did this thing while exhausted and hiking up a mountain. I can certainly give a speech when the PA system broke, or my slides aren't working, or somebody's heckling me in the back row, whatever it is. Nobody would ever heckle me, of course, during a speech, because I would shoot them. But, you know, other things.
Yeah. And he's not joking. He's not joking, really.
Pardon me?
I said, and he's not joking.
I'm really not. No, I'm really not.
Anything to add there, Scott? It's an interesting question.
No, you know, when it comes to these flow questions, I feel like I pick up my ears and I listen to Stephen Kotler about this stuff. So that was fascinating to me, what he just said. Yeah.
Yeah, here's another interesting one, Scott, which I think you may have some thoughts on as well, and Stephen for sure. It's from Ankit. Is there a way to unlearn the habit of not having grit? And obviously there's an assumption in there that, you know, not having grit is a habit, but I'll let you guys speak to that.
So I think Angela actually, it was right where the conversation ended, which was sort of on this discussion around momentum and the feeling of momentum. And I think if you overcome the way to fight back against it, there's probably a whole bunch of things we could say here, but what research seems to show most consistently is little wins. Just a little bit of dopamine today, a little bit of dopamine tomorrow. It's little wins over a period of time. You don't need the big wins. You don't need something gargantuan at all. I think, in fact, more than anything else, I think you just need proof that you can sort of be a little grittier on it. You know, if I were to, I would chunk it down. I would try to be gritty on something I didn't like 20 minutes a day. And then the next day it'd be 21 minutes, and maybe it'd be 21 and a half minutes, right? I would really tiny little wins in terms of how I would apply myself and how to overcome it. The dopamine, it's not just the dopamine you get with day one, or the dopamine you get day two, or anything else. It's the knowledge that applying myself repeatedly over time at something I don't like actually produces a feeling I do like, the dopamine, and it's a consistent thing, and I can trust that. I can begin to believe in that mechanism. I think that's it's the belief plus the momentum. One or the other alone, I don't think will get it done, but both together, I think, start to get you there. Scott, what do you think? Because I'm sort of, by the way, everything I just said, I'm sort of that I don't have research to back up a lot of that. I was winging that one.
No, I think you nailed it. I would have said it's all about building the habit of being the kind of person who perseveres when you're not enjoying something. Angela's work has shown repeatedly that gritty people are they're actually in love with the hard work. They fall in love with the hard work. They don't fall in love with the activity. It almost becomes a point where what they're in love with is no longer the activity, but the fact that they're showing progress and they're showing mastery, and even when it's not enjoyable. And I think a lot of her grit paragons that she highlights in her book really show that as the case quite clearly. You know, a lot of them they weren't in the mood to do the things that they did, but they were the type of people that thrived off of overcoming that other side of themselves. You know, there's something there's a certain reward that humans get, and this is going to be really deep philosophical now, but there's a certain reward I think humans get from when one side of themselves conquer another side of themselves. I don't think we talk about that enough in psychology.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Stuart
yeah.
Brand once said the only sustainable happiness is making progress in meaningful work. Which or pride in one's progress is also another way he put it. And I kind of think over time, at least in my life, I don't want to speak for other people on this one, but I think that's been very, very true. I think grit is like, it's funny because you talk about it as grit and it sounds like it's this hard thing to get, but I actually agree with you. I think it's a great source of joy.
Yeah. And Christine Davidson, sorry, it's funny and making me chuckle. She said, that's when you marry the suck.
You don't just embrace it, Christine. You're right. You marry the suck.
But I want to point that out because Angela did publish a paper. I feel like I'm Angela's spokesperson now that she's left. I feel a certain responsibility to point to some of her research. But she published this paper showing that those that have longer enjoyable marriages tend to be grittier people. She has actually published that data, and I have given some talks, some keynotes, things where I mention, I say to the audience, what is the best predictor of a long, passionate, happy marriage? And everyone guesses everything else but grit, right? And then I say, actually, grit. Like,
that's brilliant.
That's
really neat. That totally
when
makes sense
passion wanes. Passion's going to inevitably wane for anything, for your partner, for what you're going. But if you still believe in it. Right. I'm not saying stay with an abusive person. I want to be very clear. Obviously, what I'm saying, it's important to know when to grit, and it's important to know when to quit. that is true. But in terms of marriage and keeping the passion alive, gritty people recognize that passion is going to ebb and flow in anything, whether it's a marriage or whether it's the work that you're doing. It all applies to the same thing. You need that grit to still overcome it and keep going and persevering. And it depends. Do you still believe in the mission? Do you believe in your marriage? If you believe in it, be gritty. Be gritty about it.
How do you guys think about quitting in relation to grit and then potentially more specifically perseverance? Do you have any proxies or
I think it's I think this is such a great, deep, hard peak performance question, because we train grit, we train for like everything we do, and yet you have to know when to walk away, right? You have to know when you're throwing good money after bad, to use an economic metaphor. But there is that line, and the grittiest, most successful people I know all sort of intuitively know, okay, this is I'm across this line, and I'm just going to walk away from this particular project. Though I have found, and this is true for myself and true for a lot of people I've talked to about this, I think when you're gritty and you walk away from a project, for example, you don't ever walk away for good. You're saying, I can't do this now for reasons X, Y, and Z, but I love this idea. I'm going to park it over here and see what happens. I very rarely do I see people walking away completely. I see them parking things temporarily. But I think the question of when do you quit and how do you know when to quit and where's that line? What do you think, Scott?
I have a whole section in my
quitting.
book.
He's done. He's out.
No, I'm looking for my copy of Transcend. Everyone has a copy of Transcend.
Tell me what page you need. What page do you need? I'll just get that for you.
Can you look up in the purpose chapter? There's a section on knowing when to quit. I talk about the research on that just towards the end of the passion.
Towards the end of the chapter.
Yeah, but the point here is that if you view and Angela didn't talk
knowing
much
when
about,
to move on. Here we go. Page 183, folks.
That's right. That's right. You could buy the book just for that one section alone would be worth the price of admission. But anyway, the thing is,
page 183 will change your life. Don't you wish you could see it?
But it's all about that. It's all about that topic, and I'll just briefly summarize the point I was getting at there. Angela talks a lot about the goal hierarchy. We have top level goals. That's our guiding North Star. What future vision of ourselves do we want to be? Who? But it's important to recognize sometimes that North Star might become a time in our life where it's no longer serving us. It's serving our growth. And I think it's important to constantly, in your grit journey, to be reassessing whether that it's time to change that higher level goal. We have a higher level goal in the goal hierarchy, and just a brief primer on goal hierarchies. It's a rich field in psychology. They differ in their levels of abstraction. So at the top level, you may simply, I want to be healthy. Below that, you have specific things like diet, exercise, things that will get you healthy in different domains. And then under each of those things in the goal hierarchy, you have even more specific things, concrete things like with dieting, paleo diet, or only eat this. And you also have if-then statements and things to cut out of your life that might be taken away. Anyway, long story short, I think it's really important sometimes to constantly be reassessing in our lives whether or not. I'm not suggesting we quit early. I think we should stay a course. But if we get to a point where we really realize that our top level goal is no longer who we are now, I think it's important to recognize that that's okay to move on. It's not about quitting. See, I don't view it as quitting. All of life is a journey. This is my philosophy. Now I'm bringing in my humanistic psychology philosophy. It's not like you're quitting when you transition from one top level goal that doesn't serve you, who you are now and who you want to be anymore, to a different thing you want to be. You're not quitting. There's no quitting there. You've just, it's actually wisdom. It's wisdom.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, Scott. Yeah, that makes sense. Stephen's thinking.
Often? Yeah. Well, I was wondering, because I've never. Most of the goal setting stuff, we agree with you. There seems to be 3 levels of goal setting that come up over. We talk about it. That top level is a massively transformative purpose, right? That's the term Peter and I used in Abundance and Bold. Now that I came up with that term, I'm fucking stuck with it apparently. But okay, massively transformative purpose. Okay, and then there's high hard goals, right? And then clear goals. Your daily to do list. My question is, have you ever seen anything? We're talking about when do you refresh the mission statement for your life or your high hard goals, right? When is it time to revisit them? And I know obviously it's going to vary individually. Have you ever seen anything that puts a number on how often is it useful to revisit them? Anything that kind of pokes it at the practical, how often do I come back to my goals and revise them question? You just said it. You said you think it's useful to do. How often is it useful to do?
It's a really brilliant question, Stephen, and it's one that just how Angela had her moment earlier where she's like, I wish I knew exactly the lever to press, and I wish I knew exactly when we should reassess, because it's really important. On the one hand, I'm going to be such a nerdy, nuanced scientist for a second. On the one hand, it's so important, and the main lesson Angela's work teaches us, I think, is make sure you don't quit too early, because you don't know how close you could be to something. A lot of people actually quit after a couple failures, and they don't realize that just even the next day they probably would have gone over it, and then they'll never know. And so that's a big message of Angela's work. But that's different than saying, if you're working on something and you are even progressing, but you don't feel it in your soul anymore, you don't feel like it's really helping you grow as a whole person. It's just helping maybe one narrow slice of who you are. Because the best high level goals are those that help you grow as a whole person. They're the ones that on every dimension, emotionally, spiritually, physically, in terms of exercise and health, and mentally, those are the best goals. Those are the best high level goals that you want to devote your resources to, so you can get most bang for your buck of developing your full self-actualization being. But even if you are making progress towards that and you don't feel like your whole self is growing, I think it is worth questioning whether you picked the right high-level goal for yourself. That's my best answer to that question. I wish I could give you a precise answer.
All right, Rian, I have to ask Scott a question. Only because the last time we were together on this, it was the launch party for your book Transcend, and I always say William Gibson, the science fiction writer, had a great quote, which is, I love going out on book tour because I get to talk to people and they tell me what I've been up to in my life these past 5 years. Right. So we always,
that's really
every
funny.
time I go out on book tour, right, people always tell me, and I'm like, oh, that's what my book is actually about. Did not know. Thank you. Right. So we're now 6 weeks past launch with your book, 5 weeks past launch. I don't know how far we are past launch. Something like that, maybe 6 weeks. What have you learned about your book and what you wrote know now that you didn't know the last time we had on? What's new in your thinking about Maslow? What's new in your thinking about your own work?
I'll be very, very like vulnerable in answering that question. Okay. I have felt in the past couple weeks with the state of America and with so many people suffering that it doesn't feel authentic, or it feels a bit empty focusing on the top of the pyramid, and talking about, we all just need to transcend when there are so many structural issues and things that are rightfully so pitching us into a state of intense distrust of each other, anxiety, cynicism towards our fellow humans. There are so many environmental structures, and as well as one could argue major gaps in leadership, that to rally us all together as a one species. So I'm really taking your question really seriously, and I'm answering it really seriously, because in the past couple of weeks, I really have, I feel differently about the purpose of my book than I did when I was on your show 2 months ago. I now actually feel like what I think the book can offer people and what I want to offer people is not the message where I just shoot right to the top and say, here are the 5 ways to hack transcend, or here's the ways to just have your purpose. Why don't you have your purpose already? God darn it. What's the matter with you? But now I actually feel like I want to show people psychologically exactly what happens when you have a non-self-actualizing society, structures that don't bring out the best in us. And you have structures that cause distrust and cynicism. And what we're seeing now with the riots, with the peaceful protests, which are beautiful. I cried watching some of these peaceful protests on TV. They're people that are trying to say, look, there is a common humanity here that exists. That's the part of the pyramid that I all of a sudden have found myself focused on, and I don't feel authentic. I'm not excited as much as I was 2 months ago talking about transcendence and flow and peak experiences. That stuff lit me up more 2 months ago. Now I feel like I'm focusing more on, look, these experiences of cynicism and distrust are actually predictable based on what we know about human nature and what happens when you have structures that are inhibiting growth. We have structures that are actively squashing the human potential for self-actualization, and people are reacting in predictable ways based on what we know about human nature. So that's my answer to that.
What a great answer, Scott.
Thank you. Great
Scott,
answer.
if you were to write a book about the bottom of the pyramid, what would you call it, out of curiosity?
Wow.
What's the word kind of that comes to mind, rather than
Rung
transcend?
1. Let's call it Rung 1.
Well, that's a good marketing idea.
Rung 1.
I mean, the idea inequality.
Scott and I are actually working on this book, folks.
I wonder what would the word inequality popped into my head, when you said that. But I think it's a really interesting conversation to be had, a really nuanced conversation about, well, what do we mean exactly by inequality of opportunity? And that's what I would focus on, is the inequality of resources and support to realize your passion and perseverance. I didn't expect us in our conversation today to kind of go there. That's why you guys make magic in these webcasts, because your guests never know what direction it's going to go. But I think that I'm glad we're kind of in a way ending what started as talking about, grit and passion and perseverance, to actually recognizing that a lot of people have passion and perseverance, but get zero opportunities to express it. You can have all the passion and perseverance you want in the world, and if you're in an extraordinarily poor environment where there's very poor schooling and people are being shot all around you, that grit doesn't mean a hill of beans. I don't know.
Do you think grit? I don't even know how to phrase this in a scientifically accurate way, so give me a little bit of space to fuck this up. But do you think you could assign, do you think grit correlates at all to culture? There's cultural training in grit, there's and grit, do you think, or do you think it's in the individual override the cultural, or the cultural overrides individual? And one of the things
Great
I was
question.
wondering about, I wanted to talk to Angela about this, is the question of cultural resilience and cultural grit, which certainly it seems like we all need right now, more than not more than anything. We probably need equality a hell of a lot more than we need anything. But
yeah,
anyway,
you ask such beautiful questions. I put in a link earlier. Maybe Claire can find it again. But I just published an interview I did with Martin Seligman today for my podcast, and the title of the podcast I think is very relevant to your question. It's From Learned Helplessness to Learned Hopefulness, and I think that we can get in a state of learned helplessness where we feel we actually can make choices to make our lives better, but we've been beaten down so much, like those dogs were in the original learned helplessness studies that Martin Seligman did, that we don't open up the box even when we know we can be free. And so I think that society matters, but I also think there's a part of which our own the will can override certain things. And what Martin Seligman found, and this is so fascinating, and maybe Claire can link to this as well. Martin Seligman, this is actually going to be harder for her to find, and if she does find this would be really incredible. But Meyer and Seligman wrote a review paper a couple years ago, Learned Helplessness After 50 Years, What We Learned. And what they wrote in that paper is that we learned we were 100% backwards in our original theory. It was actually quite shocking to field of psychology when they admitted we got it completely wrong when we originally came up with our learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is not what is learned. It's the lack of hope that and dogs don't have that prefrontal cortex that can learn to envision a future self, become
you haven't met my dog, so don't disparage all dogs. You can just talk about the dogs
but most dogs
okay.
and humans, what gives us an amazing capacity when you learn helplessness research humans compared to the original research in dogs, they found that the way we can overcome learned helplessness is by future-oriented thinking and by envisioning and learning hope is something that is not the default response in humans, but it's something that we can do. And I also highly recommend my good friend wrote a book called Learned Hopefulness, Dan Tomasillo. It just came out. I wrote the foreword to this book. This book meant so much to me that he asked me to write the foreword. He said he needed it in a couple of days. And on my Thanksgiving last year, I canceled all my plans and I spent the whole day on Thanksgiving just writing the foreword to this book because that's how important I think it is. It's called Learned Hopefulness by Dan Tomasillo, and it has activities and things so you can you can really make sure learned helplessness is not your default response. It doesn't have to be among humans, regardless of our circumstances. Claire, could you find that
Scott,
book? Yeah.
Oh, by the way, Connor found your hard to find paper because Connor's a PubMed wizard.
Amazing. Just so you know, I have the PDF of that on my website. Yeah. He didn't link to the full article, but yeah. So go.
This is something comes out of Angela's research. It references something you just said, and I was just curious. So in her research on self-control, one of the strategies she talks about, there's a lot of them, but it was making our future selves relatable. Do you know about this? Can you speak to that at all? I just really wanted to ask her, and since you're speaking for Angela and she's gone, I was going to ask you just that question. What the hell is that? Making our future selves relatable, and how does that help me get more self-control?
I'm good at channeling Angela. I worked. You have to understand. I worked with her at the Positive Psychology Center right next door. The Grit Lab at that time, I don't think it was the Character Lab yet. It was still the Grit Lab. Was right next door to the Imagination Institute.
Oh, the Imagination.
And so we would just be smoking pot and daydreaming all day, and they would actually be doing gritty things all day. So it was quite a juxtaposition. I'm joking about the pot, Dad. I'm joking. I know my dad's on here. But I was just saying, we daydreamed all day.
I'm the guy who's smoking pot. Scott, not at all. Blame it on me.
But
I'll take the fall here.
It's my cheeky humor, but at the Imagination Institute, we studied imagination, and Angela, they focused. They were always like, we could hear them next door. Angela yelling at everyone, "Big ready, big ready!" And we're just over here like, daydream. But so it was a funny juxtaposition, but we made it work, and we became such dear friends, and we put on a symposium together, the Grit Imagination Symposium we held at Penn, where we bust in educators from all over the country, and we asked the question, what do children look like who are dreamers and doers at the same time? And this does answer your question. So a lot of doers do become very, very comfortable and friendly with their future self, the image of their future self. They can see it so vividly. It's so vivid in their mind. People like, you watch The Last Dance, people like Michael Jordan, they had such a intimate connection to that future self they knew they would be someday. They knew what their destiny is. It's important. I think it's actually amazing when you discover, your destiny. And some of the sounds I know sounds very, and I don't think Angela would quite put it that way, but I do believe there is such a thing of discovering your positive destiny, as I've described it. Maybe Claire can find an article I wrote called Positive Destiny, where I distinguish that between negative destinies, because we have lots of destinies within us. I have a destiny within me to become really obese by eating lots and lots of chocolate, because I love chocolate. That's my destiny too. But what we need to discover is our positive destiny. What is the highest potentiality within us that wants to be actualized just as much as the eating the chocolate drive wants to be actualized? If you find that and you become friends with that destiny, become intimate with it, I think you can really increase it. Is this too much? Is this too woo-woo for people?
I love that, Scott. The chocolate example is great.
Yeah. The chocolate example is great.
Have I lost people with that one?
No,
more people are jumping on.
More people are jumping on. They're not leaving yet.
Stephen, do you have a final question? I know we gotta wrap pretty much now. Do you want to chime in with a final question before I ask Scott where people can find out more?
I don't. I actually want to take the minutes and just. I'm watching the names. I'm watching the questions. I can't do one of these without kind of acknowledging the absolutely kind of kick-ass, amazing minds, people in the audience. Claire, once again, thank you so much. I got to give another shout out to Amethyst because it's my thing. Shout out to Amethyst. And everybody, just thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be back. It's the first Thursday of every month. That is our live event, so we're going to be doing it again in a month. Thank you so much, and of course Scott is going to be back and back. We love him. He's not going anywhere.
You're going to see more Scott.
I love you guys.
Yeah, thank you all so much, folks, and Scott, thank you so much as well. It's always just so epic having you on. Where can people?
Scott, you said you've got a Transcend course you were thinking about teaching. Did you want to tell people about that? Is there a way they could reach out to you if they're interested in that?
Thank you so much.
Yes, feel free to mention everything, Scott, before we jump.
That's the big one. I want to mention. I'm going to put a link in where at the top you can subscribe to my monthly newsletter. So I just put in a link, and at the top you can just put your name and email address and be part of my newsletter. I promise I don't spam you. It's usually just once a month. But
he's lying. He does spam you. I'm part of his newsletter. I get things every week.
Not true. Not true. If anything, I'm too gingerly about my newsletter. But reason why I'm recommending people to sign up is I'm going to be making a big announcement, huge announcement, earth-shattering announcement. Is that for the first time, now I'm going to go in the mode of the marketer. For the first time, I'm bringing my Columbia course, The Science of Living Well, to the everyday people. I am going to. I decided to create for the first time. I've never done this before. An 8-week course adapting what I taught at Columbia, The Science of Living Well, but for the general public. And I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited to share that with people, and I'll be making the announcement and ways of registering on my newsletter. So you can sign up for my newsletter. You'll get it at some point in the next month or so. Thanks for giving me that opportunity to say that.
And then Scott, the book obviously as well is the other place to go. So definitely encourage anyone who has not yet read Transcend pick up a copy or listen to it on. It's on Audible, Scott. I'm pretty positive, isn't it?
It is on Audible, and I'm reading it. I read
Oh,
it.
did you read
No,
it?
nice. There you
Oh,
go.
that's great.
People say that
Nice.
they like my voice when I read it. I go in very Shakespeare.
By the way,
mode.
that deep, that was a very sexy radio voice.
Yes. Welcome to
late night,
Transcend. This is
easy-
how I read it.
easy
Welcome to
jazz.
Transcend. The
Yeah,
new
I
style
like the
of
mic
lifestyle
hold as well.
Actualization. Read by none other than the notorious SBK.
You got to change your podcast.
I like
intro
the
to
fact that the nickname that I gave you that at that event has stuck. This is like 7 years, 8 years later. You're still the notorious SBK. I like it.
I appreciate it. No, I appreciate you giving me that name.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much, Scott. And thanks again, as Stephen said, thanks to everyone. You've all been epic, amazing engagement. And we're excited for the next one of these in 4 weeks' time.
Rian, can you save
Thank
the
you,
chat
guys.
log? Can you save the chat log
Pardon
for
me?
me so I
Yeah,
can read it later?
totally. We can send it to you.
I can't wait to eat
Yeah.
popcorn and read all the comments later on.
Yeah.
Thanks
All
everyone.
right,
Thanks
folks.
for
All the
coming.
best. Thanks a million.
Thank you all,
Stay right
guys.
there.
Thanks,
Take
Angela.
care.